The city roared like a living beast, its pulse thrumming through concrete veins and neon-lit arteries. Arjun Patel, a young Indian migrant, stepped off a dusty bus into this chaos, clutching a scrap of paper with an address that held the promise of a new life. His heart swelled with hope until a venomous voice cut through the din, spitting words that burned like acid. "Go back to where you came from," sneered Richard Grayson, a man whose polished suit masked a heart hardened by contempt. In that fleeting clash on a crowded sidewalk, neither man could know that fate was already weaving a tapestry of justice, one that would unravel their lives and stitch them back together in ways that would echo far beyond the city's skyline. Arjun Patel's shoes crunched against the gravel-strewn pavement of East Side Avenue, the weight of his journey etched into every step. At 24, he carried more than the faded backpack slung over his shoulders. He bore the dreams of his family back in Gujarat, a small village where dust swirled around modest homes and hope was a currency hard-earned. His mother had sold her gold bangles, his father had taken a second job at the local mill, and his sister Priya had forgone her college dreams to fund his one-way ticket to America. "You'll make us proud," Priya had whispered at the airport, her eyes glistening. Arjun clung to those words now, as the city loomed around him, towering, indifferent, and loud. The air smelled of exhaust and fried food, a stark contrast to the earthy scent of his village. Skyscrapers loomed like giants, their glass facades reflecting a fractured version of the world below. Arjun's destination was Bright Star Dinner, a greasy spoon at 224 East Side Avenue, where he'd secured a job as a dishwasher. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start, a foothold in a land that promised opportunity but demanded resilience. As he navigated the crowded sidewalk, a man in a tailored suit barreled toward him, his polished shoes clicking with purpose. The man Richard Grayson, though Arjun wouldn't know his name until later, barely slowed as he shoved past, knocking Arjun's shoulder. "Move it, Curry!" Richard spat, his voice dripping with disdain. Arjun stumbled, catching himself against a lamppost. The word stung, sharp and unfamiliar, though its venom needed no translation. Richard's blue eyes glinted with malice, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're clogging up the sidewalk, idiot!" Arjun's throat tightened. He wanted to respond, to explain he was just trying to find his way, but the words tangled in his chest. English, though he'd studied it for years, felt clumsy under the weight of this man's gaze. Around them, passers-by glanced over, some with amusement, others with discomfort before hurrying on. Richard didn't wait for a reply. He strode off, his Rolex catching the sunlight, leaving Arjun to gather his composure, swallowing his shame. Arjun checked the crumpled paper in his hand and pressed forward. The diner's neon sign flickered ahead, a beacon in the urban sprawl. He pushed open the glass door, a bell jingling above, and stepped into a world of clattering dishes and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and grease, and the hum of conversation filled the space. Behind the counter, a woman with tired eyes and a clipboard looked up. "You the new guy?" she asked, her voice brisk but not unkind. Her name, tag-read Carla, manager. Arjun nodded, handing over his work permit with hands that trembled slightly. Carla scanned the document, then sighed. "All right, you're on dishes. Back room's through there. Don't screw up." Arjun followed her gesture to a swinging door, stepping into a steamy, cramped kitchen where pots clanged and dishwater sloshed. A burly cook named Tony tossed him an apron. "Keep up, kid," Tony grunted, pointing to a towering stack of greasy plates. Arjun tied the apron around his waist, rolled up his sleeves, and plunged his hands into the scalding water. The work was grueling, but he welcomed it. Each scrubbed plate was a step toward stability, toward proving he could make it here. Richard Grayson was a fixture at Bright Star Diner, as much a part of the place as the chipped formica tables and the jukebox that hadn't worked in years. A real estate broker with a corner office and a reputation for closing million-dollar deals, Richard carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the world owed him its best. His suits were custom, his hair meticulously gelled, and his smile, when he bothered to show it, was more weapon than warmth. But beneath the polish, Richard was fraying. His firm was bleeding clients to a rival agency, and the pressure from his boss, a steely woman named Margaret Voss, was relentless. Richard's visits to the diner were less about the food and more about control. He'd bark orders at the waitresses, complain about the coffee being too cold or the eggs too runny, and leave tips so paltry they were almost an insult. The staff tolerated him because he was a regular, and his presence often meant a quick table turnover. But no one liked him. On Arjun's second day, Richard walked in, his mood darker than usual. He just lost a major deal, a penthouse sale that would have netted him a six-figure commission. He slumped into his usual booth, scanning the diner with a scowl. When Arjun emerged from the kitchen to bus a table, their eyes met. Richard's lip curled. "Hey, you!" he called, his voice slicing through the diner's hum. "Yeah, you, the busboy. You spilled water on my table." Arjun froze, a tray of dirty dishes balanced in his hands. He hadn't been near Richard's table, but the accusation hung in the air, drawing every eye in the room. "Clean it up," Richard snapped, tossing a napkin onto the floor. "Or I'll have your job." The diner fell silent, save for the faint sizzle of the grill. Arjun's heart pounded, but he set the tray down and knelt to retrieve the napkin, his movements deliberate to hide his trembling. Richard leaned back, smirking. "Pathetic," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is why they shouldn't let people like you in." The words cut deeper than Arjun expected. He'd faced skepticism back home, neighbors who doubted he'd survive in America, but this was different. This was personal, laced with a hatred he couldn't comprehend. He stood, clutching the napkin, and returned to the kitchen without a word. Tony, flipping burgers, gave him a sympathetic glance but said nothing. Richard's taunts became a ritual. He'd mock Arjun's accent when he overheard him speaking to a coworker, accidentally knock over glasses for Arjun to clean, and make snide comments about foreigners stealing jobs. Each encounter chipped away at Arjun's confidence, but he refused to break. He needed this job, his family's sacrifices depended on it. At night, in the tiny room he rented in a boarding house, he'd write letters to Priya, carefully omitting the humiliations. "The city is big, but I'm learning," he'd write, his pen shaking. "Soon I'll make you proud." Arjun's days blurred into a rhythm of soap suds and sweat, but he was no stranger to hard work. Back in Gujarat, he'd helped his father in the fields, hauling sacks of grain under a merciless sun. The diner was just a different kind of field, and he approached it with the same grit. He stayed late to scrub the grill, learned the menu by heart, and even started helping Carla with inventory when a supplier shorted them on napkins. His quiet diligence didn't go unnoticed. One rainy evening, as Arjun swept the diner's floor after closing, Carla called him over. Her hair was frazzled, her eyes heavy with the weight of running a 24-hour operation, but her tone was softer than usual. "You're doing good, kid," she said, leaning against the counter. "Better than most. I'm putting you on the register tomorrow. Don't mess it up." Arjun's chest swelled with pride. The register was a step up, a chance to interact with customers, to prove he was more than a pair of hands in the dish pit. He nodded, unable to suppress a smile. "Thank you, ma'am." "I won't let you down." The next morning, he stood behind the counter, his apron crisp and his posture straight. The cash register was intimidating, its buttons a maze of numbers and functions, but he'd spent the night memorizing the manual Carla had given him. Customers came and went, some impatient, others kind. Arjun greeted each with a polite nod, his accent thick but his words clear. Most didn't notice him beyond their orders, but that was fine. He was learning, adapting, carving out his place. Then Richard walked in. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and his face bore the strain of a man on the edge. The rumor mill fed by waitresses who overheard his phone calls said his firm was in trouble. A major client had jumped ship, and Margaret Voss was breathing down his neck. Richard didn't notice Arjun at the register until he went to pay for his meal, a burger he'd barely touched and a coffee he'd complained about twice. "You?" Richard scoffed, tossing his credit card onto the counter like it was trash. "They're letting you handle money now? Hope you don't rob the place blind." Arjun ignored the jab, swiping the card with steady hands. The machine beeped and a red message flashed. Declined. He tried again, same result. Richard's face reddened, his jaw tightening. What's the problem, genius? He snapped. Sir, your card isn't working, Arjun said, keeping his voice even. Do you have another? Richard leaned over the counter, his voice low and venomous. You're saying I don't have money? You some nobody from nowhere are telling me I can't pay? The diner quieted again, heads turning. Run it again, or I'll have you deported. Carla, wiping down a table nearby, stepped in. Enough, Richard, she said, her tone sharp. Pay up or leave. Grumbling, Richard fished another card from his wallet, which barely covered the bill. He stormed out, muttering about the diner going to hell. Arjun exhaled, his hands still steady. He'd faced worse than Richard's tantrums, but each one left a mark, a reminder of how fragile his place here was. Richard's world was unraveling faster than he could admit. The fraud scandal at his firm wasn't just a rumor, it was a tsunami. An internal audit revealed cooked books, and while Richard wasn't directly implicated, his name was tied to too many bad deals. Margaret Voss called him into her office on a gray Monday morning and delivered the news with the precision of a guillotine. You're done, Grayson. Clear out your desk. By week's end, creditors had seized his car, his bank accounts were frozen, and his luxury apartment was on the verge of eviction. The man who'd once closed million-dollar deals was now scouring job listings, his resume patchwork of half-truths. Desperation led him to Bright Star Diner, where a help-wanted sign hung in the window. Dishwasher, minimum wage. It was a far cry from his corner office, but he had no choice. When Richard walked in for his interview, the diner was quiet, the lunch rush long over. He adjusted his tie, a cheap one he'd bought to replace the silk ones he'd sold, and scanned the room. His stomach dropped when he saw Arjun behind the counter, now wearing a supervisor's badge pinned to his apron. Carla had promoted him after he caught a supplier overcharging for produce, saving the diner thousands. Arjun's calm efficiency and knack for problem-solving had made him indispensable. Richard's pride screamed at him to walk out, but his empty wallet kept him rooted. He sat across from Arjun, who conducted the interview with a professionalism that stung more than any insult. Why do you want this job, Mr. Grayson? Arjun asked, his tone neutral but his eyes steady. Richard swallowed, his throat dry. I need work, he said, the words tasting like ash. I'm reliable. I'll do what's needed. Arjun nodded, jotting something on a notepad. The job is dishes, mostly, some cleaning. It's hard work, long hours. Can you handle that? Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yeah, I can handle it. You start tomorrow? Arjun said, standing to shake his hand. Richard hesitated, then took it, his grip weak. The man who'd once thrown napkins at Arjun's feet was now his subordinate. Richard's first week in the dish pit was a descent into a world he'd never known. The steam burned his hands, the grease stained his clothes, and the endless clatter of plates was an assault on his nerves. He worked in silence, avoiding Arjun's gaze, his pride a raw wound. The other staff, Tony, the waitresses, even Carla watched him with a mix of pity and amusement. They'd all endured his tantrums as a customer. Now he was one of them. Arjun, meanwhile, thrived. His promotion to supervisor came with a raise, enough to start saving for Priya's ticket to America. He ran the diner's front end with quiet authority, diffusing customer complaints and streamlining operations. Carla trusted him to close up most nights, a responsibility he took seriously. But he never lorded his position over Richard. When Richard struggled with a stack of pots, Arjun showed him a trick to scrub faster. When Richard's car broke down, leaving him stranded, Arjun covered his shift without a word. One night as they locked up, Richard lingered by the door. The diner was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. I was wrong about you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What I said, what I did, I'm sorry. Arjun paused, the keys jingling in his hand. He saw not the man who'd humiliated him, but someone broken by life's unpredictability. We all make mistakes, he said. What matters is what you do next. He handed Richard a cup of coffee, a small gesture that felt like a bridge. Richard never became a saint. His temper flared occasionally, and old habits died hard. But he stopped sneering at the staff, and his apologies, though rare, were genuine. He worked hard, earning grudging respect from Tony and the others. Arjun, meanwhile, saved enough to bring Priya to the city. Together, they launched a food truck, Gujarat Bites, serving kashoras and dakla that drew crowds from across the city. The diner remained a hub of stories, but none as striking as the one where karma turned a tormentor into a dishwasher and a migrant into a leader. Arjun never forgot Richard's cruelty, but he chose to forgive, not for Richard's sake, but for his own. The city, with its endless churn of lives and dreams, had taught him that hate was a burden too heavy to carry. Richard, humbled by his fall, learned to see the people he'd once dismissed. And in the shadow of those skyscrapers, too, men found that sometimes the greatest victories are the quiet ones built not on vengeance, but on the courage to move forward.